The dome was dead when Alara Sen first saw it. She stood at the far end of Corridor 14, maintenance level, her transfer orders still warm from the printer in her back pocket, and stared through the observation port at what the station manifest called Habitat Module 7. The glass was fogged with condensation on the inside, which meant the atmospheric processors were still cycling, still pushing air into a space nobody had entered in years, but beyond the haze she could make out the shape of it. A broad, low-ceilinged greenhouse dome, roughly 40 meters across, its interior a landscape of gray. Dead soil in raised beds, desiccated root systems. The skeletal remains of what had once been climbing vines, now brittle lattices draped across support trellises like the bones of something that had stopped trying. The station was Vistara Relay, a mid-tier waypoint on the Kessler shipping lane. It processed cargo, fueled short-range haulers, and housed a rotating population of dock workers, freight handlers, and administrative staff who came for the hazard pay and stayed, because the next posting was always 6 months away. Alara had been assigned here as a replacement agricultural technician, the third in 2 years. According to the transfer clerk who had processed her arrival, with the expression of a man handing someone a shovel and pointing at a landslide. The dome hasn't been operational since the Tessavari displacement, the clerk had said. Director Vasic sealed it after the last botanist resigned. Something about the soil being contaminated, or the children, I don't remember which. The children, Alara had said. The clerk had looked at her with the particular blankness of someone who had learned not to elaborate. Ward 6, East Wing, 16 Tessavari orphans. They were housed near the dome before it was sealed. The previous botanist said they kept getting in. Director Vasic moved them to the interior section and locked the access corridor. Alara had thanked him and walked the length of Corridor 14 alone. Now she pressed her palm against the observation port and felt the faint warmth of the air cycling on the other side. Dead but still breathing. She found Ward 6 40 minutes later, after 3 wrong turns in a maintenance shaft that the station's internal mapping system had labeled as a corridor. The ward occupied a windowless section of the east residential block, 4 rooms converted from storage bays, the walls bare metal, the lighting a flat institutional white that made everything look like the inside of a filing cabinet. The door was open. Alara stopped in the frame. 16 children. She counted them automatically, the way she had been taught to count seedlings in a propagation tray by sweep, by color, by spacing. They were Tessavari, which she had read about in the xenobiology brief that came with her transfer package but had never seen in person. Small frames, some no taller than her hip, pointed ears, oversized eyes enormous, luminous, tracking her from across the room with the specific stillness of creatures assessing whether a new presence meant danger or irrelevance. Skin colors ranging from pale lavender to ash gray to a soft mint green, and one child near the back wall with skin the color of desert sand and hair like spun copper. All of them were sitting on the floor, some on thin mattress pads, some on the bare metal. 2 were perched on the edge of a low storage crate that served as the room's only furniture besides the cots. None of them were moving. None of them were speaking. The silence was not empty, it was held. It had the quality of a room where sound had been tried and found dangerous, and the occupants had collectively decided that stillness was the safer currency. A woman in a medical aide's uniform appeared behind Alara. Her name tag read Corporal Luda Hen. "You're the new agricultural tech," Hen said. It was not a question. Alara Sen. "The dome is sealed. Director Vasic has the access codes. You'll need to submit a formal reactivation request through station maintenance, and I'll tell you now, the last request sat in the queue for 9 months before it was denied." Why was it denied? Budget. The dome isn't rated as essential infrastructure. The hydroponics bay on level 3 handles the station's nutritional supplement production. The dome was always a secondary system, atmospheric enrichment, recreational green space, that sort of thing. When the displacement wave brought the Tessavari children, the dome was repurposed as a therapeutic environment, but the botanist who ran it left and nobody replaced her for 11 months. By then the plantings had died and the soil had gone acidic. Vasic sealed it rather than pay for remediation. Alara looked back at the children. 16 pairs of eyes, each one a different shade: amber, silver gray, soft green. One child with eyes the color of pale honey, all fixed on her with the same expression. Not hostility, not hope. Something between the two. A flat, patient watchfulness that said they had seen adults come and go, and had learned that the coming meant nothing until you saw what the adult did next. "What kind of therapeutic environment?" Alara asked. Hen's expression shifted into something careful. The Tessavari are phytosensitive. Their neurology responds to living plant matter, chlorophyll signatures, volatile organic compounds, the presence of active photosynthesis. In a healthy Tessavari community, children are raised in bonded green spaces, family groves, communal gardens. The connection is neurological: their cortisol regulation, their sleep cycles, their capacity for speech development all depend on proximity to growing things. She paused. These children haven't been near a living plant in over 2 years. Alara stood very still. 2 years? Since the dome was sealed. Some of them were already in developmental arrest when they arrived. The ones who came from the colony failures, their family groves were destroyed in the displacement. They've never had sustained phytocontact. The medical team has done what it can with synthetic chlorophyll supplements, but it's like treating dehydration with damp towels. The supplements keep them alive. They don't keep them growing. Alara looked at the children again. Now she saw what she had missed in the first sweep. The stillness was not just behavioral, it was physiological. The children's skin had a dull quality, a flatness that she recognized from years of working with plants, the look of something that was not dead but had stopped metabolizing at full capacity. Their hair, which the xenobiology brief described as luminous and subtly iridescent in healthy specimens, lay flat and matte. Their ears, which should have tracked sound with fine muscular articulation, were held rigid. They were not dying, they were dormant. "I need to see the dome," Alara said. Getting into Habitat, Module 7 took Alara 3 days, 2 formal requests, 1 maintenance override she technically did not have authorization to perform, and a 20-minute argument with Director Vasic's administrative assistant, who informed her that the director was off station for budget review and would not return for 6 days. "Then he can review my reactivation report when he gets back," Alara said. "I'm going in today." The assistant looked at her with the expression of someone deciding whether to file a complaint or simply wait for the problem to solve itself. Alara had seen that expression on the faces of agricultural managers across 4 postings. It meant she had approximately 48 hours before bureaucracy caught up. She entered the dome through the maintenance airlock on the south side, carrying a soil sampling kit, a portable atmospheric analyzer, and a crate of tools she had requisitioned from the station's general stores under the category Essential Agricultural Assessment. The airlock cycled with a groan of old hydraulics, and the inner door opened on a breath of warm, stale air that smelled like dust and the faint chemical ghost of decomposition. The dome was worse than it had looked through the observation port. The raised beds, 12 of them, arranged in a radial pattern around a central hub that had once held a water recirculation system, were filled with compacted gray soil that had the texture and vitality of powdered concrete. The root systems she had seen through the glass were everywhere, threading through the beds and up the support trellises and across the ceiling framework in a dense web of dead fiber. The irrigation lines were intact but dry, their nozzles crusted with mineral deposits. The grow lights, a ring of full-spectrum panels mounted above each bed, were dark. The water recirculation hub at the center was a tangle of corroded piping and sediment-clogged filters. Alara knelt beside the nearest bed and pushed her fingers into the soil. It resisted, dense and airless. She pulled out a handful and held it up to the overhead lighting. The color was uniformly gray, no variation, no microbial bloom, no trace of the dark, loamy richness that living soil carried. She brought it close to her face and inhaled. Nothing. No earthiness, no biological tang, just mineral dust. She took samples from all 12 beds. She tested pH, nitrogen content, phosphorus, potassium, organic matter percentage, microbial activity. The results came back in a pattern she had seen before, on worlds where mining operations had stripped the topsoil and left behind a substrate that was technically soil in the same way that a skeleton was technically a body. Depleted, sterilized, dead. But the dome's atmospheric processors were still running. The structural framework was sound. The irrigation plumbing was intact beneath the corrosion. The grow lights, when she traced their wiring back to the power junction, drew current. The panels themselves were functional, just switched off at the breaker. Alara stood in the center of the dome and turned slowly, taking in the full scope of the wreckage. 40 meters of dead garden, 12 barren beds, a water system that needed a complete teardown, soil that needed to be rebuilt from the microbial level up, and 16 children whose neurology was starving for what this room was supposed to provide. She started the next morning. The first thing she did was open the grow lights. She walked the ring of 12 beds, resetting each breaker in sequence, and the panels flickered to life one by one. Full-spectrum daylight, warm and clean, flooding the dome with the first real light it had seen in over 2 years. The effect was immediate and physical. The gray soil did not change, but the space itself transformed. Shadows retreated, the dead root lattices threw intricate patterns across the beds, and the air began to warm as the lights cycled up to full output. The second thing she did was start the water. The recirculation hub took 4 hours of work, disassembling the sediment filters, flushing the intake lines, replacing 2 corroded valve assemblies from the station's plumbing stores. When the pump finally engaged, water moved through the system for the first time in 2 years, running brown and then tan and then clear through the irrigation nozzles, dripping into the dead beds with a sound that Alara felt in her chest. The third thing she did was inoculate the soil. She had brought a microbial starter culture in her personal kit, a concentrated suspension of mycorrhizal fungi, nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and decomposition organisms that she had carried from her previous posting on Farron Station, where she had rebuilt a contaminated hydroponic bay from scratch. The culture was her most valuable possession, more important than any tool. She diluted it in the recirculated water and fed it into the irrigation system, letting it percolate through the dead beds like medicine into a vein. Nothing visible happened. Nothing would for days. Microbial colonization was invisible work, the organisms spreading through the compacted soil, breaking down dead root matter, releasing nutrients, building the microscopic architecture that living plants needed to take hold. It was the slowest kind of repair. It was also the only kind that worked. Alara had learned patience on her second posting, where an industrial spill had sterilized 8 hectares of cropland. She had spent 14 months inoculating that dead field, rebuilding its microbiology layer by layer, and the colony manager had called her a fool for 12 of those months. She was not a fool, she was patient, and patience was the hardest thing to explain to people who wanted visible results. She was adjusting the drip rate on bed 7 when she heard the airlock cycle. Alara turned, the inner door opened and a child stepped through. Small, lavender skin, darker at the joints and along the jawline. White hair that fell in a straight curtain past narrow shoulders. Eyes the color of pale honey, wide and fixed on Alara with an intensity that had nothing to do with fear. The child was wearing a station-issue jumpsuit 3 sizes too large, the sleeves rolled to the elbows, the hem dragging on the floor. The child stood in the airlock doorway and did not move. Alara did not move either. She had enough experience with frightened animals and wary seedlings to know that the first response to something that came to you was stillness. You did not reach. You did not call. You held your ground and let the thing decide. The child's nostrils flared. The enormous honey-colored eyes swept the dome, the lit panels, the wet soil, the running water, and something shifted in the child's posture. The rigid ears relaxed by a fraction. The flat, held stillness softened into something Alara could only describe as attention. Then the child took 3 steps forward, knelt beside bed 4, and pressed both palms flat against the wet soil. The sound the child made was not a word. It was a tone, a single sustained note, low and resonant, that vibrated in the air like a struck bell. Alara felt it in her sternum. The child held the note for 5 seconds, 10, 15, and then stopped. The child's eyes were closed. The small hands were buried to the wrists in the dark, wet earth. When the child opened her eyes, she looked at Alara and said a word. Thela. Alara did not know the word, but she knew the tone. It was the same rising inflection she had heard from every living thing that found water after drought. It meant alive. Corporal Hen found Alara in the corridor outside the dome 2 hours later. Alara had soil under her fingernails and the satisfied expression of someone who had discovered that a problem was solvable. The Tesavari child who entered the dome, Hen said. Her name is Ciel. She is one of the more withdrawn residents. She hasn't spoken in 7 months. She spoke today. Hen's face did something complicated. What did she say? One word. I don't know the translation. I'll pull the linguistic database. But Sen, you can't let the children into the dome. Director Vasic sealed it for a reason. The reactivation hasn't been approved. If a child is injured in an unapproved space. She wasn't injured. She touched the soil. She made a sound. It was the first sound she's made in 7 months. Hen opened her mouth, closed it, and then said the thing that Alara had been waiting for someone to say since she arrived. What are you going to do? I'm going to grow a garden, Alara said, and I'm going to let them help. The next 6 days were a war conducted in soil and silence. Alara worked the dome from station dawn to station dusk, stripping dead root matter from the trellises, aerating the beds by hand with a long-handled fork, adjusting the microbial feed rates as the inoculation culture began its slow colonization. The work was physical and repetitive, and exactly the kind of labor that gave her mind room to plan. The children came one at a time. Ciel returned the next morning, slipping through the airlock with the silent precision of someone who had learned to move without being noticed. She went directly to bed 4, pressed her hands into the soil, and held the same sustained tone. This time, when she opened her eyes, she looked at Alara and pointed to the irrigation nozzle. In Roman 7, she said, water. On the 3rd day, a second child came. A boy, ash-gray skin, silver hair cropped short, eyes like polished steel. He stood in the airlock doorway and watched Ciel with her hands in the earth for 20 minutes before he crossed the dome and knelt beside bed 9. He did not touch the soil immediately. He watched Alara work the methodical turning of earth, the careful placement of the irrigation nozzle, the way she tested the moisture level with her fingertips, and then he copied her motions precisely, his small gray hands turning the soil with the same slow, deliberate strokes. He did not speak, but he came back the next day and the day after that. By the end of the first week, 5 children were visiting the dome regularly. They came at different times, stayed for different durations, and engaged with the space in different ways. Ciel worked the soil and sang her single tones. The gray boy, whose name Alara learned was Kale, turned earth with mechanical precision. A tiny mint-green girl named Vess carried water in a repurposed canteen, making trips between the recirculation hub and the beds with the focused determination of someone performing essential work. A lavender boy named Osh sat cross-legged beside bed 12, and arranged pebbles in patterns that Alara recognized, after 3 days of observation, as the Tesavari numerical system. The fifth child was the one with desert sand skin and copper hair. Her name was Marit. She did not touch the soil or the water or the tools. She stood at the edge of the dome and watched. Alara let her watch. She had learned, across 12 years of coaxing things back to life, that the ones who watched longest were usually the ones who needed it most. The watchers were the ones whose trust had been broken so completely that participation felt like a risk they could not afford. They needed to see the pattern hold, the adult returning, the work continuing, the space remaining safe before they could step into it. Marit watched for 6 consecutive days. She stood in the same spot, near the airlock, with her arms wrapped around herself and her copper hair falling forward to obscure half her face. Her enormous eyes, a deep, warm amber, tracked every movement in the dome. She watched Alara turn soil. She watched Ciel press her hands into the earth. She watched Vess carry water. She watched Kale measure and scratch his marks into the bed frames. On the 6th day, Marit moved 3 steps closer. On the 7th, she sat down on the edge of an empty bed frame, her feet dangling above the floor, and stayed for 4 hours without moving from the spot. Corporal Hen told Alara what little the medical files contained. Marit had been recovered from a derelict transport vessel 18 months ago, the only survivor. The transport had been carrying refugees from a failed settlement on Drassic IV. The vessel's life support had degraded over a period of weeks. By the time a patrol cutter found it drifting in the Kessler shipping lane, only the cargo hold was still cycling breathable air, and Marit was inside it alone. The other passengers, including, presumably, her family, had sealed the cargo hold from the outside before the rest of the ship went dark. She had not spoken since recovery. Not one word. Not one sound. The medical team had classified her as electively nonverbal, which was a clinical way of saying that the child had decided that the world was not a place worth talking to. Alara did not push. She greeted Marit each morning the same way she greeted the soil, with steady presence, and the assumption that time would do what force could not. On the 8th day, Director Vasic returned to the station. He summoned Alara to his office at 700, before she had finished her first cup of synthetic coffee. Vasic was a tall man with the compressed energy of someone who managed by attrition. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply applied steady administrative pressure until the obstacle either moved or was reclassified as acceptable. "You entered a sealed habitat module without authorization," he said. "I submitted a reactivation request. Your office didn't respond. Because the module is not scheduled for reactivation. The agricultural assessment was intended to determine whether the space had salvage value for material reclamation, not whether it could be replanted." "The space has value," Alara said. "The structure is sound, the atmospheric processors are functional, the irrigation plumbing is intact. The soil is depleted but recoverable. I've already begun microbial remediation." "At whose expense?" "My own. The starter culture was mine. The tools were requisitioned under standard maintenance allocation. I haven't exceeded any budgetary threshold." Vasic studied her with the look of a man who had found a procedural loophole being used against him, and was deciding whether to admire the craftsmanship or close the gap. "The children," he said. "Corporal Hen tells me they've been entering the dome. 5 of them voluntarily. They come, they work with the soil, and they leave. No one has been harmed. The dome is not rated for unsupervised child occupancy. If a child is injured, then I'll be there. I'm in the dome every day, dawn to dusk. They're not unsupervised." Vasic leaned back. "Ms. Sen, you are an agricultural technician. Your job description does not include child development, xenopsychology, or therapeutic program design. The Tesavari children are under the care of the medical team. Whatever you think you're doing in that dome, It is not your mandate. Alara had been waiting for this. She had learned, across 4 postings and 12 years of rebuilding dead spaces, that the argument that moved administrators was never the emotional one. It was the structural one. Director, the Tessavari children on this station are phytosensitive. Their neurological development depends on proximity to living plant matter. They have been without sustained phytocontact for over 2 years. In that time, their developmental markers have flatlined speech, social engagement, motor function. The medical team has been managing them with synthetic supplements that are inadequate by every published standard. The dome is the only space on this station capable of providing what they need. I can restore it, but I need 12 weeks and I need you to not lock me out. Vasek was quiet for a long time. 12 weeks, he said. 12 weeks. If the dome isn't showing viable plant growth by then, I'll file my own shutdown report. And the children. They come voluntarily. I don't bring them. I don't make them stay. They come because the dome is the first place on this station that has felt like anything other than metal and recycled air. Vasek looked at his desk, at his hands, at the transfer report sitting in his queue. Then he said, 12 weeks. No budgetary overrun, no incidents. If a child is injured, you're off the station on the next hauler. Understood. And then, if this doesn't work, the dome gets stripped for materials. The reclamation order is already drafted. Alara stood. Then I'd better make it work. The soil woke up on day 11. Alara was testing the pH in bed 3 when she noticed the color change, a faint darkening at the edges of the sample, where the gray mineral dust was giving way to something richer. She tested it again. The organic matter content had risen from 0.3% to 1.2% in 4 days. The mycorrhizal network was establishing. The bacteria were breaking down the dead root matter and converting it into humus. It was invisible progress. No one looking at the beds would have seen a difference. But Alara knew what that color change meant. It meant the soil was becoming soil again. She planted the first seeds on day 14. They were radishes, fast-growing, hardy, forgiving of imperfect conditions. She had brought the seed stock in her personal kit, saved from the Farron Station garden. She planted them in bed 3, where the soil remediation was furthest along, spacing them precisely, covering them with a thin layer of the enriched substrate, and adjusting the irrigation to maintain consistent moisture. The children watched her plant. 7 of them now, the original 5 plus 2 newcomers, a pair of ash-gray siblings who came together and worked together and communicated in a system of hand gestures that Alara suspected was their own invention. The 7 children stood around bed 3 and watched Alara push each seed into the dark earth with her thumb. And when she finished, Ciel knelt and placed both palms on the soil above the seeds and sang. The tone was different this time. Not the single sustained note of the first day, but something more complex, a rising phrase, 3 notes, that carried a quality Alara could only describe as encouragement. A sound made for growing things. The seeds did not sprout for 4 days. When they did, tiny green arcs breaking the soil surface, each one no thicker than a thread vest, was the first to see them. She made a sound that Alara heard from across the dome, a sharp, high, involuntary note of recognition. Alara looked up from bed 7 and saw the mint-green girl standing over the radish bed with both hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide, her entire body trembling. It was the most animated she had ever seen a Tessavari child. By that evening, all 16 children had visited the dome. They came in 1s and 2s and small silent groups, filing through the airlock with the gravity of pilgrims entering a sanctuary. They gathered around bed 3 and looked at the radish sprouts, 9 green threads in a line of dark soil, and the room filled with a sound that Alara had never heard before. The children were humming. Not singing, not speaking. A collective low-frequency vibration that seemed to come from their chests rather than their throats, a resonance that Alara could feel in the floor plates. The humming lasted for 3 minutes. When it stopped, the children stood in silence, looking at each other with expressions that Alara did not have a name for but recognized in her gut. It was the look of something waking up. Corporal Hen came to the dome that evening. She stood in the airlock doorway and looked at the 16 children dispersed among the beds, some working soil, some carrying water, some sitting with their hands in the earth and their eyes closed. And then she looked at the radish sprouts. "Ciel asked me a question today," Hen said quietly. "A full sentence. Subject, verb, object. She hasn't constructed a full sentence since intake." "What did she ask?" "She asked when the flowers would come." Alara looked at the beds, dead soil becoming alive, seeds becoming sprouts, children becoming children again. "Tell her soon," Alara said. The next 4 weeks were the hardest. The radishes grew. Alara planted beans, lettuce, herbs, anything fast-growing that she had seed stock for. The children took ownership of individual beds, and the work shifted from Alara directing to Alara supporting. Ciel managed bed 4 with the intensity of a small general, assigning watering duties and monitoring soil moisture with a focus that bordered on obsessive. Kale, the gray boy who had never spoken in Alara's presence, developed a system for tracking growth rates using marks scratched into the bed frames, a record-keeping method that Corporal Hen later identified as an adaptation of Tessavari agricultural notation, a knowledge system the children should not have had access to, which meant it was either instinctive or inherited from parents they no longer remembered. The problems came from outside the dome. The first was Director Vasic, who sent a facilities inspector on day 22. The inspector walked the dome, noted the unapproved soil amendments, the unregistered seed stock, and the miners present in a non-residential space without formal program authorization. He filed a report that landed on Vasic's desk the same afternoon. Alara was summoned again. The inspector flagged 11 code violations, Vasic said. The inspector flagged 11 technicalities. The soil amendments are standard mycorrhizal cultures approved for use on any colonial station. The seed stock is registered in my personal agricultural inventory. The children are supervised by me during all dome hours and by Corporal Hen during her medical rounds. The formal program authorization doesn't exist because you haven't created one. Write the authorization, Director. Call it a therapeutic pilot. Call it agricultural training. Call it whatever lets you put a code number on it. But do not shut down the one thing on this station that is actually working for those children. Vasic studied her for a long time. Then he opened a form on his terminal and began typing. The second problem was worse. On day 31, a supply clerk named Dara Finn filed a formal complaint. The complaint alleged that the dome's water usage was impacting the station's potable supply, that the grow lights were drawing power from the residential grid, and that the presence of biological soil cultures posed a contamination risk to the station's food production systems. Every allegation was false. Alara spent 2 days documenting the dome's water usage, 4.2% of the station's recycled output, well within the allocation for a secondary system, its power draw less than the lighting in Corridor 14, and the biosafety profile of the mycorrhizal cultures, classified as GRAS, generally recognized as safe by every colonial agricultural standard in the registry. She filed her response with the station's operations office and copied Corporal Hen. But the complaint had done its damage. For 3 days, while the investigation was pending, the dome was placed under restricted access. The children were not permitted to enter. The effect was immediate. Hen reported it to Alara on the second day. Ciel had stopped speaking. The 2 ash-gray siblings had retreated to the back corner of the ward and were rocking. Vess, the mint-green girl who carried water, had not eaten in 36 hours. Kale had punched a wall. Not hard enough to break anything in the wall, but hard enough to break two of his own small gray fingers. Hen found him sitting on the floor of the ward with his hand in his lap, his face dry, his steel-colored eyes fixed on the sealed corridor that led to Corridor 14. He had not been trying to hurt anyone. He had been trying to reach the dome. The medical incident required a report. The report required an explanation. The explanation was that the 16 Tessavari orphans on Vistara Relay had been removed from the only therapeutic environment that had produced measurable developmental improvement in over 2 years, based on a complaint filed by a supply clerk whose allegations were demonstrably false, and that the predictable neurological consequences of that removal had now resulted in physical injury to a minor. Ilara wrote her own report. She attached Hen's medical data, the speech development metrics, the cortisol level comparisons, the sleep normalization charts. She attached her soil analysis showing the mycorrhizal colonization progress. She attached the water usage and power consumption figures that demolished every claim in Fenn's complaint. And she attached a single photograph that Hen had taken on day 28. Ciel and Kale and Vess, kneeling together around the radish bed, their hands in the soil, their faces lit by the grow panels, their expressions carrying something that no clinical metric could measure, but that anyone with functioning eyes could see. They looked like children, not stored children, not managed children, children. The operations office reviewed the complaint. They reviewed Ilara's response. They reviewed Hen's medical report. They reviewed the photograph. The restriction was lifted on the morning of the 3rd day. Ilara opened the airlock, and the children came in like water returning to a dry riverbed, not rushing, not chaotic, but with the steady, inevitable quality of something flowing back into the space it was meant to fill. Ciel went to bed 4, pressed her hands into the soil and sang. Ilara stood in the center of the dome and listened to the sound fill the space, and she made a decision. She was not going to wait for the next complaint. She was going to make the dome so essential that shutting it down would require more courage than any administrator on this station possessed. She began planting the flowering species. The seeds came from a xenobotanical supplier on Marin Station, ordered with Ilara's personal funds, and shipped on a cargo run that took 9 days. Tessavari sympathy blooms a family of flowering plants native to the children's homeworld that produced volatile organic compounds specifically calibrated to the Tessavari nervous system. The compounds promoted cortisol regulation, sleep normalization, and critically speech development. They were not medicine. They were environment. The thing that healthy Tessavari children breathed every day of their lives in a functioning community. She planted them in beds 1, 2, and 6, using enriched substrate from the most mature beds. The seeds were different from anything she had worked with before, small, hard-shelled, with a faint luminescence that was visible only in low light. She handled them carefully, spacing them with the precision of someone who understood that each seed was not just a plant, but a piece of a world these children had lost. Ciel watched her plant. The child's honey-colored eyes tracked each seed from Ilara's palm to the soil, and when the last one was covered, Ciel looked up at Ilara and said the longest sentence she had ever spoken in colonial standard. "They need to hear us," Ciel said. "What?" "The seeds. On our world the grower sings to the seeds. The seeds learn the voice. When they grow toward the voice." Ilara looked at the child. Ciel's lavender skin had changed in the weeks since the dome reopened. The flat, dull quality was giving way to a subtle luminescence, a faint inner light that had not been there before. Her ears moved freely now, tracking sounds with the fine muscular control that the xenobiology brief described as a marker of healthy development. Her hair had begun to show the iridescence that Ilara had read about but never seen. The child was coming back to life, and she was telling Ilara how to help. "Then sing to them," Ilara said. Ciel knelt. She placed her hands on the soil above the seeds, closed her eyes, and began to sing. It was not the single tones of the early days. It was a song complex, structured, with a melody that rose and fell in patterns Alara could not follow but could feel. The other children stopped what they were doing. One by one they gathered around the bed, and one by one they began to join. 16 voices, 16 frequencies. The sound built in layers, each child adding a tone that interlocked with the others like the components of a chord that had been waiting to be assembled. The dome resonated. Alara felt it in her teeth, in the soles of her boots, in the raised hairs on her forearms. The sound was not loud. It was deep. It was the sound of something remembering what it was. The song lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, the children sat in silence around the bed, their hands in the soil, their eyes closed, their breathing synchronized. Marit, the Desert Sun girl who had only ever watched, was kneeling beside Ciel with her palms pressed into the earth. She was crying, not in distress, in relief. The tears ran down her sand-colored cheeks and fell into the soil, and Alara understood that this was the first time in this child's memory that she had been part of what she was meant to be part of. Alara did not interrupt. She stood at the edge of the circle and kept watch, the way a gardener watches rain. Later that evening, after the children had returned toward 6, Hen found Alara in the dome running a chemical analysis on the soil where the sympathy bloom seeds had been planted. The readings were unusual. The nitrogen cycling in those beds had accelerated beyond anything the microbial culture alone should have produced. "They're singing," Alara said, staring at the data. "The tonal resonance. It's not just cultural, it's biochemical. The sound frequencies are stimulating microbial activity in the soil." Hen leaned against the doorway. "We've known for decades that the Tessavari bond with green spaces is bidirectional. What nobody could study, because the displacement destroyed almost every bonded grove in the sector, was whether the bond could be re-established from scratch. Every published paper says it requires multi-generational root systems, established groves, inherited symbiotic networks. These children are building one from nothing." "Not from nothing," Hen said. "From you. You gave them the substrate, you gave them the seeds, you gave them the space. They're doing the rest because that's what they are. They are the other half of this equation. The plants need them as much as they need the plants." Alara looked at the data again. The numbers confirmed what her instincts had already told her. This was not just a garden anymore. It was a living system, and the children were part of it. The third problem arrived on day 44, and it was the worst one yet. A transfer order landed on Hen's desk. The Colonial Displacement Authority, the bureaucratic body that administered refugee placement across the Kessler sector, had identified a consolidation facility on Verith Station, 3 shipping lanes away, that was accepting Tessavari minors. The order instructed Vistara Relay to prepare all 16 children for transfer within 14 days. Hen brought the order to Alara at station noon. Alara read it standing in the dome, surrounded by green beds and the faint hum of children working, and felt the document in her hands like a blade. "Verith Station," Alara said. "What kind of facility?" "Standard displacement housing. Metal walls, synthetic nutrition, centralized processing. No green space. No therapeutic program. It's a holding facility, Sen. They store children there until permanent placement becomes available, which in the current backlog means 2 to 4 years. These children cannot go back to synthetic supplements and metal walls. They will regress. Everything we've built." "I know." "Then fight it." Hen's expression was the look of someone who had fought systems before and knew the cost. "I've filed a medical objection. I've documented the phytobond establishment and the developmental data, but the CDA operates on capacity metrics. They see 16 beds occupied on a station that isn't classified as a child welfare facility, and they see 16 beds available on a station that is. The math is simple. The biology isn't, but the math is what they read." Alara spent the next 3 days building a case. She compiled every piece of data the dome had produced: soil recovery metrics, plant growth rates, atmospheric chemistry readings showing the volatile organic compound levels that the sympathy blooms were generating. She compiled hens' medical reports, every speech milestone, every cortisol measurement, every sleep cycle improvement. She documented the children's participation in the dome program. Ciel's coordination skills, Kale's growth rate tracking system, the Ashgray siblings' vocabulary acquisition, Vess's dedicated water management, Marit's first word. She wrote a formal petition to the Colonial Displacement Authority, requesting that the transfer order be suspended pending completion of the therapeutic program. She attached a detailed technical assessment of the dome's phytobond recovery project. She attached Hen's medical objection. She attached the photograph of the children in the garden. And she attached a single page of her own writing, not a technical document but a statement, addressed to whoever at the CDA would read it. It said, "These children are not inventory. They are not capacity metrics. They are living beings in the process of recovery, and the recovery depends on a specific, non-transferable biological environment that exists in one place in this sector. Moving them will destroy what they have built. I am asking you to see them." She submitted the petition on day 47. The CDA's response window was 10 business days. The children did not know about the transfer order. Alara and Hen agreed on that without discussion. The children had experienced enough disruption. They would not add the weight of institutional uncertainty to the fragile stability the dome had created. But children, Alara had learned across a lifetime of working with growing things, knew more than adults gave them credit for. They read the texture of adult behavior the way Alara read soil composition, by feel, by instinct, by the quality of what was not being said. On day 49, Ciel approached Alara in the dome during the afternoon work session. The child's face was composed, her lavender skin carrying the subtle luminescence of advancing phytobond recovery, her honey-colored eyes steady. "Something is wrong," Ciel said. "You are worried. Your hands move differently when you are worried." Alara looked at her own hands. She was holding a watering canister. Her grip was tighter than it needed to be. "I'm working on something," Alara said, "a problem that needs solving." "Is it about us?" Alara hesitated. The child was watching her with the precise, patient assessment that Tessavari children brought to everything, the inherited attentiveness of a species that had evolved in symbiosis with its environment, reading living systems the way humans read faces. "Yes," Alara said, "but I'm handling it." Ciel considered this. Then she said, "On our world, when the grove is threatened, the grower does not handle it alone. The grove helps." "How?" "By growing," Ciel said. "The grower protects, the grove grows. That is how it works." She turned and went back to bed 4, and Alara stood there with the watering canister in her tight grip and understood that the child had just told her something important. The best thing the children could do was exactly what they were already doing: grow, recover, become undeniable evidence of their own need. The CDA's response arrived on day 56. The transfer order was suspended for 90 days, pending a formal review of the therapeutic program's outcomes. The review would require a site visit by a CDA evaluator and a comprehensive medical developmental assessment of all 16 children. 90 days. Alara had 90 days to make the dome so thoroughly essential, so comprehensively documented, so undeniably necessary that no evaluator with a functioning conscience could recommend removing the children from it. She went to the dome and opened the airlock. The children filed in. She knelt beside bed 3 and began working, and the dome filled with the sound of small hands in living soil. The sympathy bloom sprouted on day 61. They came up in pale spirals, not the vertical push of the radishes and beans, but a slow, helical unfurling that looked like something stretching after a long sleep. Ilara monitored them hourly. She had never grown Tessavari sympathy blooms before, no human had, as far as she could determine from the xenobotanical literature. Everything she knew about their growth cycle came from Tessavari agricultural records that Hen had located in the station's cultural archive, translated by a linguistic database that rendered the tonal poetry of Tessavari horticultural science into flat colonial standard paragraphs that read like instruction manuals written by someone who had never held soil. But the children knew. Without being asked, without being instructed, they adjusted their behavior around the sympathy bloom beds as if following a protocol that lived in their blood. They sang to the shoots every morning, the three-note rising phrase that CL had introduced, now carried by all 16 voices in a layered harmonic that Ilara could feel resonating in the bed frames. They visited the beds individually throughout the day, pressing their palms against the soil in what Hen described as contact meditation, a practice that the published Tessavari literature said was performed by master growers with decades of experience, not by orphan children who had been separated from their cultural practices for years. "They're not learning it," Hen told Ilara one evening, watching two of the younger children sitting motionless beside bed 2 with their hands in the earth. "They're remembering it. The knowledge was always there. The environment just wasn't." By day 66, the first leaves had opened, broad, translucent, with a faint bioluminescence that pulsed in time with a rhythm Ilara could not identify until Hen pointed it out. "It's their heartbeat," Hen said. "The plants are synchronizing with the children's cardiac rhythm. That's the phytobond it's establishing." Ilara watched the leaves pulse. Slow, steady, calm. The same rhythm she could see in the children's breathing as they worked the beds around her. The dome was not dead anymore. It was not yet alive. The sympathy blooms had not flowered. The soil in beds 8 through 12 was still in early remediation, and the climbing vines on the trellises were brown skeletons that would take months to replace. But the space had crossed a threshold. The air smelled different, richer. The particular sweetness of chlorophyll and wet earth and the faint, almost subliminal fragrance of Tessavari symbiotic chemistry doing what it was designed to do. The children were different too. Hen's medical reports documented it with clinical precision. Speech development across all 16 children had accelerated. CL was now conversational in colonial standard. Kale, who had never spoken in Ilara's presence, had begun using two-word phrases with the medical staff. The Ashgray siblings were teaching each other vocabulary from a picture book that Ilara had left in the dome. Vess had started sleeping through the night for the first time since intake. Marit had spoken her first word. She had knelt beside a sympathy bloom, touched one of the pulsing leaves, and said, "Home." The word had traveled through the ward like a current. Hen told Ilara about it with wet eyes and a voice that kept catching. On day 67, the first sympathy bloom flowered. It opened at station dawn, a pale violet spiral with 5 translucent petals that seemed to hold light inside them. The fragrance was immediate and unmistakable, a warm, complex, living scent that filled the dome within minutes and made Ilara's eyes water, not from irritation, but from something she could not name. The children knew before she did. They arrived at the airlock before Ilara had finished her morning check, 16 small figures filing in with an urgency she had not seen from them before. They gathered around the blooming plant, and the sound they made was the song, the full song, all 16 voices, rising in the dome like something that had been waiting 2 years to be released. The sound carried through the ventilation ducts. Hen heard it in the medical bay. The maintenance crew on Corridor 14 heard it. 2 dockworkers on the cargo level stopped what they were doing and looked up at the ceiling. Director Vasic heard it in his office. He came to the dome. Ilara saw him in the airlock doorway, tall, rigid. his face set in the administrative mask she had come to know over 12 weeks of arguments and requisition forms and procedural negotiations. He stood in the doorway and looked at what his station had become. 16 children in a garden, green beds where gray had been, a flowering plant whose petals pulsed with the rhythm of small hearts. The sound of voices that had been silent for years, singing in a language that predated every system on his station by 1,000 generations. He looked at Alara. She looked back. "The remediation request," he said. "I'll approve the full budget." "Thank you." "And the therapeutic program designation. I'll file it today." "Thank you, Director." He stood in the doorway for another full minute, watching the children work. Then he turned and walked back down the corridor, and if his stride was slightly less rigid than usual, Alara chose not to comment. The dome bloomed through the following weeks. 1 sympathy flower became 3, then 7, then a cascade of pale violet and soft blue and luminous white that turned the beds into a landscape Alara had only seen in xenobotanical archives, the photographic records of healthy Tessavari groves, the bonded green spaces where generations of children had grown alongside the plants that sustained them. The station noticed. Dockworkers began finding excuses to walk past the dome's observation port. Then they asked to come inside. Within 2 weeks, a dozen station personnel were visiting during off hours, sitting on the edges of bed frames, breathing the fragrance, bringing compost from the galley waste stream and spare parts for the irrigation system. Nobody organized them. They came because the dome was the only place on Vistara Relay that felt alive. The children accepted the station workers the way they accepted rain, without ceremony, without fuss. They simply made room. Ciel became the dome's unofficial coordinator, assigning beds and managing watering schedules with an authority that no one, including Alara, thought to question. The child who had pressed her hands into dead soil and said a single word was now fluent in colonial standard and conversational in 3 other trade languages she had picked up from the dockworkers who had started visiting the dome during their breaks. Kale spoke, not often and not loudly but clearly and with purpose. His first full sentence, delivered to Alara on a Tuesday morning while he was measuring the growth rate of a bean plant using his scratch mark system, was, "This one grew 14 millimeters since yesterday. The soil in bed 9 is better than bed 7. Alara had smiled. "You're right, bed 9 got the stronger mycorrhizal inoculation." He had nodded and gone back to his measurements, and Alara had stood there for a moment, watching the gray boy's small, precise hands move among the plants, and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized from every garden she had ever grown, the deep, quiet satisfaction of something that was supposed to be alive, being alive. Merritt became the dome's artist. She gathered petals that fell naturally from the sympathy blooms and arranged them in patterns on the soil surface, spirals and curves, and interlocking shapes that Hen identified as Tessavari ceremonial designs. "Gratitude patterns," Hen said. "They're made in family groves to honor the bond between the growers and the plants. She's performing a cultural practice that she was never taught. It's either instinctive or genetic memory." By day 84, when the full 12-week deadline arrived, the dome was unrecognizable. 11 of 12 beds were in active production. The sympathy blooms filled 3 beds in continuous flower, their fragrance a permanent presence in the dome's atmosphere, and, through the ventilation system, a faint trace in the corridors surrounding it. The climbing trellises bore new growth, not the old dead lattices but fresh green shoots that Alara had started from cuttings, threading upward through the framework toward the ceiling. The children had taken over 2 beds, entirely beds 10 and 11, planting, and tending their own selections with a competence that made Alara's formal agricultural training feel like a footnote. Ciel had germinated a Tessavari seed that Alara had not provided, grown from a dried pod that the child had been carrying in the pocket of her oversized jumpsuit since the day she arrived on the station. The plant it produced was small and pale and grew in a tight spiral, and when it flowered a single bloom, no larger than a fingertip, the fragrance was different from the sympathy blooms. Sharper. More personal. "It's a memory flower," CL told Alara. "From my mother's grove, I kept the pod." She touched the bloom with one careful finger. "I thought it was dead. I thought everything from before was dead." She looked up at Alara, and her expression was not the watchful assessment of the child who had first walked through the airlock. It was open, settled, the expression of someone who had found, against every reasonable expectation, a place where growing was possible. "You made it alive again," CL said. Alara knelt beside the child. She did not reach for her, she did not embrace her. She simply knelt, bringing her eyes level with CL's, and said, "You did, all of you. I just turned on the lights." CL considered this with the seriousness of a child who had learned to weigh words carefully. Then she shook her head. "No," she said, "you planted things in dead soil and you did not stop. That is why the garden came back, because you did not stop." The CDA evaluator arrived on day 87. Her name was Assessor Torin Valk, and she came with a data tablet, a standardized evaluation form, and the expression of a woman who had seen 100 facilities and expected this one to be the 101st. She was efficient, thorough, and professionally neutral in the way that people who made decisions about children's futures had to be in order to sleep at night. Hen met her at the medical bay for 2 years of clinical records and the last 3 months of phytobond recovery data. Then Hen brought her to the dome. Alara was inside, working bed 12 when the airlock cycled. She straightened and saw Hen enter with a tall woman in a CDA uniform, data tablet in hand, eyes already scanning. The children were everywhere. CL was coordinating a watering rotation at beds 1 through 3. Kale was at bed 9, recording growth measurements. Vess was running water between the recirculation hub and bed 7, her mint-green skin luminous under the grow lights. Merritt was on her knees beside the sympathy blooms, arranging fallen petals into a gratitude pattern, humming. Assessor Valk stood in the airlock doorway and looked at the dome. Her data tablet lowered by an inch, then 2. She did not speak for a full minute. Alara let the silence work. Valk walked the dome slowly, stopping at each bed, reading the growth markers that Kale had scratched into the frames, examining the sympathy blooms, watching the children work. "How long since remediation began?" she asked. 87 days, Alara said. "And the children's participation?" "From day 2, voluntarily, continuously." Valk looked at her tablet. She looked at the children. She looked at the sympathy blooms pulsing in time with small hearts she could not hear. "I've been assessing displacement facilities for 11 years, Valk said quietly. "I have never seen a phytobond established from dead substrate in under 6 months. The published literature says it takes multi-generational root networks, inherited symbiotic colonies, years." "The literature didn't account for the children," Alara said. "They're not just beneficiaries of the bond, they're participants. Their singing, their contact meditation, their presence, the Tessavari contribution to the symbiosis is active, not passive. The children helped grow this. They grew it as much as I did." Valk was quiet for a long time, then she closed her tablet. "I'll be recommending permanent placement," she said. "Here, with full therapeutic program designation and protected status. These children are not transferable. This environment is not replicable. And what you've built," she stopped, looked at the dome one more time. "What you've all built is the only functioning Tessavari phytobond recovery site in the sector. The CDA will want to study it. Other facilities will want to replicate it. You should prepare for attention." "I'll manage the attention," Alara said, "as long as the children stay." "The children stay." The dome's formal redesignation as a therapeutic agricultural environment was approved on day 89. Full budget allocation, dedicated water recycling upgrade, protected status. No future transfer order could be issued without a full medical review and the signed consent of the program director. Director Vasic signed every document without comment. Alara Sen stood in the center of the dome on the morning of the 90th day and looked at what dead soil had become. Green beds, flowering plants, climbing vines threading toward the light. 16 children moving among them with the practiced ease of creatures in their element, carrying water, turning earth, arranging gratitude patterns from fallen petals, singing. Merritt was kneeling beside the newest sympathy bloom, her copper hair catching the grow light like something burnished. She was humming a soft, steady tone that matched the pulse of the leaves around her. Her desert-sand skin had the luminescence now, the faint inner glow that meant the phytobond had taken hold. Kale was in bed 9, his scratch mark records covering every frame in a dense notation that 3 visiting xenobotanists had already asked to study. He was measuring a bean plant. He was talking to it. Ciel was standing beside her mother's memory flower, one hand resting on the spiral stem. She was not singing. She was not speaking. She was standing in the quiet, breathing the air that smelled like the world she had lost, and she was smiling. Alara watched them. She had grown gardens on 4 worlds and 2 stations. She had rebuilt contaminated soil and coaxed dead fields back to production, and spent years of her life on her knees in dirt, planting things that the people around her had already given up on. But she had never grown anything like this. She had grown a world back, and the world had grown the children back. And somehow, in the middle of all that growing, the children had grown her back too into the version of herself that remembered why she had become a botanist in the first place. Not for the plants, for what the plants made possible. The dome hummed with 16 voices and the pulse of leaves and the quiet sound of water moving through soil. Alara Sen knelt beside bed 3, the first bed, the radish bed, where it had all started, and pressed her hands into the dark, living earth. It was warm. It was breathing. It was home,